Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Azure podcast with your hosts Sam Foote.
And Anne Armstrong.
If you're new here, we're a pair of Azure and Microsoft 365 focused IT security professionals. It's episode 19 of season 4. Alan and I had a discussion around Azure DDoS Protection recently. DDoS attacks are more common than ever. If you operate internet facing workloads, ensuring there is a level of DDoS protection in place is recommended. Here are a few things that we covered. What are DDoS attacks and how to mitigate them? What is Azure DDoS Protection? How do you set up Azure DDoS Protection? And pricing and licensing. We've noticed that a large number of you aren't subscribed. If you do enjoy our podcast, please do consider subscribing. It would mean a lot to us for you to show your support to the show. It's a really great episode, so let's jump in. Hey Alan, how are you doing this week?
Hey Sam, not doing too bad. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. I feel that you've got some good Ignite news for us this week.
Some might say it might be good for some, but yeah. So I will be attending it in person. So that's good. But also not just that. I'll be helping Microsoft man some of the expert meetup areas in the security space. So I'll be there for anyone to come say hello and talk tech.
Do you know what points you'll be covering, Alan, or is it sort of just a ask me anything sort of format?
From what I've seen, I think it's going to be around the multi-cloud. So we'll probably be CSPM and Defender for Cloud Expect, that kind of stuff.
Nice.
Yeah. And if anyone's going and they're on the pre-day workshop for security, I'm also helping out on that now. So, yeah, if you're in that, you'll see me there. So come say hello.
Yeah, definitely. If you're lucky enough to get a trip out to Ignite, then definitely send Alan a message. It's definitely it's sold out so quickly this year, hasn't it? So either the capacity is very low, which I kind of doubt, or there's been really good take up this year.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of both, I expect, because it is the convention center is pretty big, but at the same time, it's not as big as the Orlando site. Definitely not, because that was like 3 buildings the same kind of thing.
Yeah,
when we last went there. So, but yeah, sold out really quickly. Only lucky to get a ticket because I'm helping Microsoft out, kind of thing, as part of my MVP benefits or contribution to it all. So yeah.
that's
So
cool.
Sam, what we talking about today?
Azure DDoS protection. It's obviously a rising challenge, I'll say. DDoS protection for sort of public facing workloads. So as we see with a lot of cloud services, it's wrapped up nicely for you into a lovely managed service.
Yeah, okay. So let's get into it then. So I guess, like you said, we're hearing a lot about around DDoS attacks. So, to start off with, what is a DDoS?
Okay, so to sort of break down the acronym to start off with, a DDoS attack is a distributed denial of service attack. And these types of attack typically focus on websites and public facing server and infrastructure workloads. At its basics, what will happen is a series of bots, or they're commonly referred to as a botnet, will flood some sort of website or service with a bunch of, say, HTTP traffic. And the idea there is to disrupt the resources that are available to that machine. So you may run some sort of public facing application or website, and your application and your infrastructure is sort of set at a level that can cope with typical traffic that you may have. It might be that you've got a blog site or something like that that maybe it gets one hit a day. I don't know. It's just something silly. So you've got very minimal resources, um, and what you've got to think is between yourself and the end user, there's many different hops that data goes through. You've got the end users, internet service providers. You've got backhauls. You've got ISPs in between. Eventually, that data gets to the data center, and then you've got networking, which effectively makes its way. Networking and routing and firewalls that makes its way to your instance, your box, potentially your virtual machine, etc. And what botnets do is they take they commonly they will be using infected endpoints, usually from the general public. So if I wanted to run a botnet, I would try to distribute my botnet, my malware, to many different endpoints. And then what it will effectively do is it will harness the bandwidth capabilities of multiple endpoints to flood a service. So a normal user clicking around a website might change web page every, I don't know, 10 to 30 seconds, maybe a bit longer if you're reading a blog post or something. But in a very basic, unsophisticated attack, a botnet will attempt to access a web page on your website just multiple times per second as quickly as they possibly can. And what that's going to do is every single time that request comes in, your infrastructure is going to need to react to sort of processing that page load. And when you get too many people on the website, I don't know if you've ever booked tickets for, say, a concert or a festival. You'll know this, where previously people would all rush to go and get tickets, and the websites would just freeze, and now we have sort of special queuing systems that still sometimes don't work, right? When you're trying to book things. But what they're trying to is the same type of idea. There's lots of people flooding to a specific place in one time to perform an action. Just so happens with a botnet, the ultimate aim isn't to book your favorite band or performer. It's to actually overwhelm and disrupt that service from operating. So we've seen a bunch of high profile attacks. So like there's been attacks against cloud providers. A lot of the times we don't actually hear about who they're actually targeting. We see reports of what those cloud providers have mitigated. But for instance, there was a big distributed DDoS attack, on GitHub a few years ago, right? So you see specific targeted attacks on specific websites, and this is kind of the idea of it is just to disrupt one particular, usually one particular service, more than anything. But we have also seen botnets attack sort of cloud providers by trying to overwhelm multiple services on the cloud provider side. If you imagine, Azure is hosting, dare I say it, hundreds of thousands or millions of websites. Sort of distributing your attack across a large variety of websites can overwhelm the provider. Maybe you would overwhelm the network switching or the routing inside of the firewall. It might not be the end servers that you're trying to exhaust there. So when cloud providers talk about DDoS mitigation, they're really talking about the total capacity that they have in their networks for DDoS mitigation. In the Microsoft Digital Defense Report 2023, it's just been released recently. It's a long but really great read, because it sort of gives you the the state of the environment and the world in which we're working in terms of security. There's every year there's a big section on DDoS, and it gets updated with even more insane numbers every year. So to give you some stats, Microsoft um, has reported that they are combating an average of 1,700 DDoS attacks per day over the past year on average. Um, Now, the size of those and who they're targeting can vary, but you can imagine, with a big cloud provider, there's just more chance of, potential disruption, especially when we, share resources between customers as well. If you were on a web server that got, you on some shared infrastructure that got targeted for a DDoS attack, that could interrupt your website, even though your website's got, absolutely nothing to do with it. Um, so Microsoft has also expanded its mitigation capacity. To be able to handle up to 90 terabits of data per second. Um, I'm not really sure that's a number that any of us sort of mere mortals can really comprehend. But to put it into perspective, the largest um, DDoS attacks that have been reported in the press were in the range of several terabytes. I believe there's is it Azure saw a terabits per second or something like that. It was pretty high. I might have the number here. Oh no, up to 3.5 terabits per second. So you can see that because they have to handle mitigation of so many, they have to have a larger capacity than um, any singular attack itself. But they could be under attack from multiple locations at the same time, and that's where that full 90 terabits per second really comes into play.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's probably not just capacity though, is it? I expect there's some other things like stopping it from getting to their services through firewalls, things like that. That immediate response to, you know, I know it's distributed, but you're going to see the same type of attack coming from multiples. There's a temporary like ban on those IPs, I guess, or something, just to stop it hitting the actual resource on the back end, kind of thing. Because, like you said, some of that could take down other services and things like that if it's like maxed or internal corporate network or corporate network, cloud network kind of thing.
Yeah, but I think you've also got to think about like routing and putting up walls, right? So, if let's say the gates are open in a way, right, with a firewall, right? So a firewall starts to get no, let's say the infrastructure behind a firewall starts to get overloaded, right? So a box starts to get overwhelmed, in its basic sense, right? In the cloud, we can obviously scale up those boxes, right? So we can start to mitigate some of that. But at what stage does it just get like too much? You then, drop the ban hammer, and then you stop all traffic through that firewall. Well, the legitimate traffic that was supposed to flow through that firewall um, needs to go somewhere as well, right? So it's not just a simple case of and I'm not saying you were saying that, but
No.
it is a really complicated scenario because you've got to try to identify what is legitimate traffic because you don't want service disruption for legitimate users, right? So it's trying to piece together all of those different signals and intelligence to shut down certain types of attacks. Um, yeah, so it's probably just worth talking about. We've talked about volumetric attacks. So this is where you flood network traffic, essentially, usually using UDP, just to flood network data. Um, there is also protocol attacks, which exploit weaknesses in layer 3 and layer 4 protocols. Um, these include SYN flood attacks, reflection attacks, and other protocol attacks. Um, and um, that's where this more intelligent mitigation then comes in, identifying those non-standard, peaks and troughs in data. Um, and then yeah, and another big one is just sort of resource layer attacks. Um, Protocol violations, SQL ingestion, cross-site scripting. You know, that is where you can also see floods of um, highly specific attacks to disruption. So it's not just overwhelming and volumetric. It also might be mass exploitation of some sort of gap in your application stack as well.
Yeah, okay. And I guess as well, you kind of talked about the auto scaling side of things. I guess it's something you got to make sure you do have some higher limits on how many you spin up. That's right for your type of normal business or when your peaks are. Because I guess potentially, a DDoS attack could incur you a large bill because you might spin up 20, 30 resources just to cope with it, even though it's not even legitimate traffic. So
Yeah,
is that to
because
consider as well?
yeah, because if you think about, let's say, retail like Black Friday, things like that, what is legitimate like e-commerce traffic like look like for you versus botnets trying to hammer your least efficient API endpoint, if that makes
Mm.
sense, to overwhelm your resources, because it's hard to with static rules to be able to mitigate against those things.
Yeah. Okay, so we kind of talked about some of these, but sort of what scenarios would an organization need, DDoS protection? You kind of hit about, front end web servers, that kind of stuff, but is there any others?
So it's probably to start off with high level scenarios. It's basically anything internet facing, right? That
Hmm.
you manage yourself, and it's more around IaaS than it is anything else. Because one of the great benefits of um, cloud workloads is Microsoft has its own DDoS protection layer in front of a lot of its own services, right? So this is one of the sort of hidden benefits, well, say hidden, but lesser known benefits of using a managed service from somebody like Microsoft, because um, if you are using if you're using IaaS, so you've got like a virtual machine, and let's go with the most basic scenario for our examples. You've got a virtual machine with a public IP address, right? It's effectively sitting right on the edge, just you know, in theory, connected directly to the internet, right? It's not in reality. Well, it kind of is, but that's the simplest thing that you've got going there. And let's say you've got an e-commerce application that you run on that virtual machine, and that's maybe your website's e-shop. Um, or you could run that application in app service, as an example. Now, app service is going to, because it's a fully managed service, you just effectively give it your code and it hosts it for you. You're not going to have to worry about the DDoS mitigation on that, because it's Microsoft's managed service and Microsoft's own DDoS protection that's layered in on top of that. But not all applications should be hosted in that way or are right to be hosted in that way. So people that run their own infrastructure, um, we've talked about public IP addresses, but basically anything that can go into a virtual network um, can be covered by DDoS protection. Things like VPN gateways, load balancers, application gateways, Bastion. There's many different services that can be covered by DDoS protection, because they are essentially public facing resources. Um, so so if you do have, I'm not even going to really say high profile, because almost the smaller you are, the more susceptible you are to a DDoS attack. I suppose it's probably worth saying that the smaller you are, the least likely you are to be targeted, right? But it also depends the type of business that you're involved in, right? Different types of businesses have you know um, it could be higher or lower risk of attacks, like social media as an example. You might host a social media network where people can interact with it and they can basically do and say whatever they like. I mean, within reason, obviously, because there is protections against that. But where you have potentially risky activity happening, and it might not be directly aimed at you, but it might be directly aimed at one of your users on your site at that point. And what we're really one scenario that people don't really talk about a lot is a DDoS response strategy, and evaluating the risks of your resources, right? Because you need to think about the topology of your resources and how they could potentially be, attacked. Like, what publicly available Azure resources do you have? Do the resources you've currently got, actually have DDoS protection built in? Because that's the first thing to think about. Because to me, I've seen a lot of organizations, they don't ever focus on DDoS until it actually happens for the first time, right? And there is actual there is actual disruption. Are there single points of failure in the service? Is there are there some API calls that aren't routed through a load balancer or a firewall that you've got? Maybe they directly connect bad practice back to an API. Maybe they skip through, API manager or something like that. Can you isolate specific services in your application structure? If one thing is hit, and you have to take it down or take it offline to, if that happens, can the rest of your application still function? What would be the impact to your business for those parts going down? Do you currently have, obviously, virtual networks that you need DDoS protection on that currently aren't enabled? And do you have failover to other regions? Could you start to mitigate yourself a DDoS attack by failing over in an active scenario to another region? There's lots of questions and planning that you can go through to start to build a response strategy. I've only really talked about risk evaluation, but really building a team around that, having alerts in place to identify a DDoS attack, are really the things that I don't believe that people are preparing for.
Yeah, okay. That's quite interesting. Yeah, you're right that having plans in place is probably quite key to understanding, like you said, how to mitigate, but also those alerts are probably quite key as well. Understanding when something's starting, so at least you can try and reduce the amount of impact it has on your application or on your service that you're hosting. And when you talked about the sort of PaaS services or even SaaS services, you're absolutely right. People, some people might not see that they're already protected by it. I think that's sometimes when you initially look at pricing for PaaS, you always think, "Well, it's more expensive. I can host that myself." It's I think we might have had this conversation before, but you're right. There's all this other layered protection. If that host goes down or whatever, it gets moved. Just generally from an infrastructure perspective, that's all managed for you. But then, yeah, you're right. All the networking's then covered as well.
Yeah, because like, if you think, one of the considerations is should I build my own? Well, I suppose the question is, if you're building something for yourself, usually it isn't public, right? So
True.
it's probably worth also just mentioning that if you do have virtual networks that don't have any public IP addressing or routing into them, you may not need DDoS protection at all, right? If you're sort of following best practice in terms of that type of thing. But if you were to, I don't know, let's really bad example, you had your CRM system that you host on some VMs. Let's say it's not even publicly available, right? Like, as in, it's not end users, but you go, oh, you know what, I'll just make it publicly available, and we'll just all log into it. I'm not saying you would do that in the real world, but I'll just give you an example that you may have resources that you don't feel are publicly accessible, but they actually are because of the way that they're configured, maybe incorrectly. So it is really key to understand, truly, if your services are actually internet facing, because yes, you could make the argument of how would people know those URLs, but that's security through obscurity at that point. You're only, a keylogger or malware away from somebody understanding, huge parts of your infrastructure.
Yeah, definitely. And talking about the sort of SaaS services just quickly, that it's not necessarily, it's related to DDoS, but not necessarily the Azure DDoS protection. But if you think about, if you've got applications on-prem and you're using things like app proxy to host them externally via that, and using Azure, basically Microsoft Entra to be your front door, I mean, imagine the capacity of that. You got this massive, it's huge, isn't it? At that point,
Exactly.
your little app behind this massive door. So yeah, okay. So we kind of talked about some of this, I think, but I guess actually calling out, what's the functionality of the Azure DDoS protection, and where can you use it?
Okay, so there's sort of two tiers to DDoS protection. You've got IP protection and network protection, right? And think about IP protection is singular internet-facing IP addresses. So think about those more, simplistic scenarios of single virtual machine pointing out to the internet, as an example. So one singular IP address covered by DDoS protection. There's also network protection, which covers essentially it's multiple protected IP addresses across potentially many networks as well. So DDoS network protection is at a higher price tier, but you can cover more resources and you can span them across subscriptions and things like that. So a lot of the functionality is the same. So it's always on traffic monitoring, always on detection. So 24/7. It would be pretty pointless if it wasn't, to be totally honest with you. But that's, I don't know why that's called out, but it's maybe some others aren't. I don't know. Automatic attack mitigation at multiple protocol levels, so level 3, level 4, and level 7 attack mitigation. So application at that top level, layer 7, application based mitigation policies as well. So we're not just talking about floods of traffic, but we're actually talking about that higher level application as well. You're going to also get alerting metrics of, to see historical potential alerts that you've had and floods of data that you or DDoS attacks that you've had. You can tune the policies to your actual specific application. So there's an element of customization there as well. It hooks into a firewall manager, Sentinel. So there's a lot. So the ability to get visibility and also coverage in different areas is there as well. So you have to have a public IP in the standard tier to get protection for DDoS IP protection, but only basic tier for DDoS network protection. So there's a slight difference in functionality dependent on which tier you go for. And then the other multiple bits are really in around response that are important. So these aren't included on the inbuilt IP protection. The sort of lower level IP protection. You get DDoS rapid response support. So, and this is on the network protection. So if you are suffering a DDoS attack, you can open a support ticket to get a rapid support response if the mitigation isn't being applied as you feel it should. if that makes sense. So you can basically call out for a lifeline with Microsoft saying, "Hey, I'm still getting hammered by this. Please can you help?" Cost protection is also in place for network protection. So if your resources have to scale up to meet demand, you will get credit back for that scale up whilst that attack is actually happening. You also get a web application firewall discount. I'm not really sure on this one, but there is effectively a discount that gets applied to your application firewall costs there. I'm not sure about why that is, but that is in place. On the IP protection, as I mentioned, it's only one per IP. So you can buy multiples of them, but you've got to buy one per IP address. But with network protection, you can have up to 100 devices. So it's probably worth talking about IPv4 and IPv6 addresses are covered, but it's probably worth talking about different limitations as well, because the types of attacks are quite sophisticated. There can be some edge cases that you need to think about. Protecting an IP resource attached to a NAT gateway isn't supported at this time. Multi-tenant PaaS services, which do include Azure App Service for Power Apps, Azure API management in deployment modes other than API Manager with virtual network integration isn't supported, and Azure Virtual WAN currently isn't supported either. And there's some other sort of edge cases. So the only thing I'd say is that it's definitely worth, with anything, going through the documentation from Microsoft, because you need to look at every single resource that you've effectively got in your environment.
Cool. That's really good about the whole, reaching out to Microsoft if you are being attacked and it's still being attacked. I didn't know about that, and the sort of not cost saving, but the what do you call it?
Protection. Yeah.
Cost protection. Yeah. Yeah, because that's kind of where when I was talking earlier about it, that you got to be careful about that. But actually, you've kind of just said, well, actually you do, but if you get this, then you've got a reasonable chance that if you are being DDoSed, then you can get your credit back in effect. So that's good as well.
Yeah, because if you think about it, right, if you do have capacity for 100 requests per second, right, and you might peak at that at certain times of the year or events or something like that, that number is just random. But if it's not a legitimate if it's not legitimate traffic, you want some protection there if you've had to scale up to a reasonable level that you would scale up to, but it was actually a DDoS attack that caused it.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so talked about what it can do. So how do we deploy it? How do we deploy Azure DDoS Protection?
Okay, so it doesn't matter which one you're deploying. It can all be done in the portal. It can also be done by PowerShell, CLI, ARM templates, Terraform, etc. And it is IP protection. You create a public IP address, and there is effectively just another blade, which is protection type, and you can just literally go in there and configure DDoS protection. We are literally talking, I'm not joking, like 30 seconds, absolute maximum. It will take longer for the Azure portal to load than it will. Apologies, Microsoft, but in the afternoon here it does slow down quite a bit. I don't know if that's true, but that's just how I feel. Right, when America wakes up, it gets slower. That's just what I think in my head. I don't know. So that is pretty much that simple. And from the network side of it, there is again a a DDoS protection plan that you can create, and then you can link virtual networks to that DDoS protection plan, because it's probably worth calling out that you can connect, if you get the DDoS network protection, you can connect a number of virtual networks across subscriptions to a DDoS protection plan. I'll call that out again when we come to pricing. But in theory, up to 100 public resources can be shared with one single network DDoS protection plan.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess that's because you might have the same policies kind of across those resources. You might have a generic configuration maybe of what your plan is, or when you want it to trigger maybe.
Well, I think it's just a case of, because you pay per IP address, if you have more than the cost of a network protection plan, it will make sense. Let's talk about pricing. Let's go into pricing, because that'll basically answer some questions there, really. Right, I'm going to bring up the pricing page, because I always like to actually reel off the right numbers. So, IP protection, the simplest setup, $199 per month, flat monthly charge per IP resource that's protected. Simple as that. Enable it for an IP, $199 a month. Easy McPeasy. Network protection. So network protection is up to 100 public resources, and it costs $2,944 per month. Then for every resource above the 100, it's $29.50 per resource per month on top, which is just, isn't that 2,994 divided by 100 anyway? So yeah, so it's just the same cost on top. You just got to buy that 100 device limit. So what we're talking 25 devices, is that right? Before you shift over. Yeah, it's 25, yeah. Right? So 2,904.
We'll get your maths right.
No, 14.
Okay.
15 public facing IP stuff. But there is also the extra protection that you get. So let's talk about those in a bit more detail. You'll get your credit back for scaled out resources. So data processing, ingress and egress for Azure file application gateway with WAF. Scale out of virtual machines and Azure Kubernetes service is covered. Data egress for network bandwidth happens during an amplification attack, when DDoS impacted apps make outbound connections, so all your outbound traffic effectively, and scaling out of PaaS resources like SQL, Cosmos DB, storage, and app services. So it's not just your IaaS, it's also your other backend services that are linked into that. I can't go into. I don't have the detail of what specific ones are covered and what is not, and I don't know how that's reconciled because I haven't seen that side of things in person. But you are getting some pretty wide-ranging guarantees from Microsoft there about protection.
Yeah, that's insane, isn't it? It does seem, I guess initially from a first view of it, it seems a little bit expensive, especially the single IP one. But I guess if you're making, your organization's making, a lot of revenue and things like that through that, it's gonna be nothing, is it, to stop you losing an hour a day, whatever it is of access, of sales or anything like that from that service, then it's gonna be nothing, is it? And as you said, a lot of some organizations may not even think about the DDoS side of it and maybe trying to mitigate it themselves within their applications.
Yeah, well, I just think I don't want to be a cloud snob, or seem like I'm on the side of the cloud providers, but $199 a month, it may not be a risk that your business thinks that it needs to mitigate. which is, I can kind of understand that as well, right? If I had a smaller business, and I didn't think I was at high risk, and that's where you need to go through that process. I think you need to think about that. You might decide, you know what, we're happy to accept that risk. And with security, a lot of conversations around risk mitigation, right? And there
Hmm.
are teams of people that work inside of organizations to work out how much they should spend on risk mitigation versus the risks themselves, right? Because, like, if your personal blog, like our podcast's website, if that got hit by a DDoS attack, we'd be like, oh, people can't access the website for X amount of time, or it gets taken offline for a certain amount of time, or whatever happens. Um, but if our website was the way that we produce revenue as an actual business, it might actually make economical sense to spend, what was that? That's $2,400 a year, basically, isn't it? In and around that number. Um, and then you've got to think about, well, how would you mitigate that in a different way? Because in the traditional sense, you might buy more capacity. If you were putting it into a data center in a rack, would you just buy more capacity and get a larger firewall appliance that could deal with that? Because a lot of those appliances have these mitigations within them. But I'd say that running your own quotes DDoS mitigation, you could say, okay, I'll put a content delivery network in front of everything. I'll let that soak it up, But then you're just shifting the quotes problem
Mm.
to a different area. And then you've also got to think about DDoS mitigation of your CDN. So it's really going to come down to, and I believe previously there was only the expensive option, if I remember rightly.
Yeah.
I think IP protection just adds the ability in there to because a lot of organizations are going to have less than 4, what was it, 15, sorry.
Mm.
I can't believe I had to use a calculator for that maths. But 15 publicly available resources. Because if you are the type of person that is the organization that has got more than 15 publicly accessible services that that believes they're high. If you've got 15, you've probably got a pretty large application or workload or site. So chances are that $2,000-$3,000 a month is going to be potentially worth mitigating that risk for.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess as well, there may be some requirements around, cyber insurance, or, maybe some regulatory compliances out there that require you to at least mitigate where you can with it. So it's also not to say ticking boxes, but putting those risk mitigations in place.
Yeah, exactly. And there is going to be a balance. There's I don't feel like it's just going to be. I know it's incredibly easy to enable, but you are also going to have to think about your application. You know, are there ways to minimize, your vulnerability to a DDoS attack? Are there ways that you can structure your application to give you protection against them, just from your perspective? Um, it may be that you don't have to, with the way that you set things up, you don't have to, you don't need a level of DDoS protection. So there's a lot of questions that I think you need to ask as you're going through this process.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so is there anything else you want to talk about around Azure DDoS protection? Is there anything you think you might have missed, or anything else you want to cover within it that we might have not sort of covered?
No, I think that's pretty much it. It's just sort of a high level look at it. If it's something you think your organization needs, it's definitely a good one to look at. There are obviously other providers and other services that are out there to do DDoS protection, but I think we can pretty much all conclude that all the large cloud providers have so much bandwidth and resource to help you mitigate. It's just part of. I believe it's just part of your sort of cloud managed services.
Yeah, definitely. And like you said, as well, they've got the intelligence to be able to all the mechanisms in the back end to determine, the DDoS attacks and things like that as well. Because, as you said, it might not just be your service being attacked. It may seem like you're being directly attacked, but actually it might be another 10, 20, 100,000 other customers being attacked at the same time, like you said. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I don't think there's any. Is there any episodes that we can link back to? I think the only one's probably like the Azure firewall one, isn't it? From a networking perspective, kind of tying it in. So that was season 3, episode 16. Got over a season ago. Wow.
Yeah. That's probably the closest one. We haven't really done many episodes on networking in Azure. That's a space that we've got plenty to potentially talk about. That's for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
So Alan, your episode next week. What are you covering?
So season 4, episode 20. So kind of been going on a Microsoft Entra journey recently, haven't we? Kind of. So I thought about it, and I think I said it about it last week when I did the external ID. We haven't really talked about Microsoft Entra ID from the basics about on-premise identities and synchronization, things like that. The sort of the foundational things about it. Having an identity in the cloud. So I'm going to talk about that and some of the capabilities there. So I think we've kind of talked about different areas of Microsoft Entra ID and in its Azure AD naming, but I don't think we've ever really talked about it as a service generally and what it's there for, kind of thing. I think we've always assumed that people would know what it is. So yeah, I think we'll start from there. And technically, normally, season 4, episode 20 is normally our last episode of the season, and we normally do a wrap up. But I think because we're still in October, we're nowhere near December yet. So yeah. I think for this season, I think we're gonna push till close to Christmas. I think so. I think we've got at least another 8 or maybe 8 episodes. Seems crazy. 28 episodes. that means like we would have done. I have to work it out later, but I think it's like 48, 50 episodes this year.
Wow, amazing. We've been pretty consistent, to be fair. So yeah, it's pretty good considering the early seasons. It was a bit,
dire,
as and when in comparison. No, that's great.
Cool. Okay, so did you enjoy this episode? If so, please do consider leaving us a review on Apple or Spotify. This really helps us to reach more people like you. If you have any specific feedback or suggestions around episodes, we have a link in our show notes to get in contact with us.
Yeah, and if you made it this far, thank you very much for listening. We'll catch you on the next one.
Yeah, thanks all.